She ran from a janitor. I walked in as the owner.
I never imagined that celebrating a decade of marriage would turn into the most soul-crushing night of my entire existence. There I sat, wedged into a chair at an absurdly long table in the heart of Manhattan, surrounded by crystal glasses that caught the light from chandeliers overhead, and the pretentious laughter of people who measured success by the logos on their key fobs. My name is Marcus Reed, and for the better part of 8 years, I've worked as a building superintendent across various properties in New York City. I know exactly what crosses your mind when you hear that. Janitor, custodian, the guy who mops up after everyone else. Every single morning before dawn breaks, I pull on my Navy work uniform, lace up boots that have seen better days, and head into the gleaming towers of glass and steel that scrape against the sky. My job involves sweeping marble lobbies until they shine like mirrors, polishing chrome handrails until you can see your reflection perfectly, scrubbing away the scuff marks left by expensive shoes worn by men in tailored suits who never once glance in my direction as they rush past. To most people walking through those buildings, I'm completely invisible, just part of the background, like the elevator music or the potted plants strategically placed in corners. But to me, this work represents something profound and meaningful. It's proof that I can stand on my own 2 feet, provide for my household, and maintain my dignity without compromising my values or begging for handouts. I've never stolen a single thing in my life, never lied to get ahead, never extended my hand for charity or help from anyone. The work isn't glamorous by any stretch of imagination, and I won't pretend otherwise. My hands are calloused and rough, covered in small scars from years of manual labor and exposure to harsh chemicals. Most nights, my lower back aches so badly I can barely straighten up when I first wake. But there's this particular kind of dignity in watching a floor gleam because of the effort you personally put into it. Seeing your own reflection staring back from a surface you cleaned with your own hands and sweat. My grandfather, old Samuel Reed, used to tell me when I was just a boy that a man's true worth isn't measured by the numbers in his bank account or the fancy title printed on his business card. He'd sit me down on his porch and say it's found in the willingness to keep pushing forward when everything feels impossible. In maintaining your integrity when cutting corners would be so much easier and more profitable. I believed those words with everything in me. Let them guide every decision I made. Unfortunately, my wife Rachel never saw things that way, not even remotely close. Rachel came from a comfortable background, the kind where money was never really discussed because there was always enough. Her family wasn't extraordinarily wealthy, but they'd never worried about making rent or choosing between paying bills and buying groceries. When we first met during our sophomore year of college, she claimed to love my strong work ethic and fierce independence. She said she was exhausted by entitled trust fund kids who'd never worked a real day in their lives, never understood the value of $1. I actually believed every word she said, thought I'd found someone who shared my values. For the first several years of our marriage, things seemed genuinely good between us. We got married right after graduation in a small ceremony, rented a modest apartment in Queens, and I genuinely thought we were building a life together based on mutual respect and partnership. But everything shifted dramatically after we moved to Manhattan for her marketing position at a prestigious firm in Midtown. Suddenly, my blue-collar income wasn't endearing or admirable anymore. It became a source of deep embarrassment for her. She started constantly comparing me to her friends' husbands, measuring me against men I'd never even met. There was Derek, who worked in investment banking and drove a sleek Mercedes that probably cost more than I'd earn in 5 years of overtime. Then Jason, some tech entrepreneur who just purchased a summer house in the Hamptons and bragged about it constantly. And Connor, who supposedly closed such a massive deal that he could retire comfortably before turning 35. Rachel would return home from brunches and dinner parties with these people and look at me like I was a permanent stain on her expensive furniture, something embarrassing she wished she could hide. The way she'd sigh heavily when I walked through the door smelling like industrial cleaning products and disinfectant. The obvious eye rolls when I'd mention picking up extra weekend shifts to help cover our bills or save for something special. The subtle but cutting comments about how real men provided certain lifestyles for their wives, how her friends never worried about money. I noticed every single slight, every disappointed glance, every moment of barely concealed contempt. But I kept telling myself that marriage meant weathering the rough patches, that love required sacrifice and patience, that eventually she'd remember why she fell for me in the first place and things would get better. So when Rachel insisted we celebrate our 10th anniversary at this ridiculously overpriced restaurant with all her college friends and their successful husbands, alarm bells should have been ringing loudly in my head. I spent nearly an hour ironing my best dress shirt, going over it 3 separate times trying to eliminate every possible wrinkle. I even borrowed a decent blazer from a coworker who felt sorry for me after I explained the situation. But sitting at that enormous table, completely surrounded by men wearing suits that cost more than my monthly salary, each one casually tossing their Tesla and BMW keys onto the white tablecloth like it meant absolutely nothing, I felt like the world's biggest fraud. Dinner started off relatively normal, at least on the surface. Wine flowed freely from bottles I couldn't even pronounce, with labels in French and Italian that might as well have been hieroglyphics. Appetizers arrived that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget, tiny portions artfully arranged on oversized plates. Everyone talked endlessly about their recent vacation to Barcelona or Santorini, the new electric vehicle they just purchased, the latest tech gadget they couldn't live without. I remained quiet, trying my best to just enjoy the breadbasket and make myself invisible. But Rachel made absolutely certain I couldn't simply fade into the background unnoticed. Her friend Lindsay was enthusiastically describing how her husband surprised her with a Model X, complete with those dramatic falcon-wing doors that rise up like something from a science fiction movie. And Rachel just couldn't resist jumping into the conversation. "Well, that's amazing for you, Lindsay. Really wonderful. Meanwhile, while all your husbands are out there closing major deals and driving luxury vehicles worth more than some houses, mine spends his entire day scrubbing toilets and mopping floors in midtown office buildings," she announced loudly enough that I'm certain half the restaurant turned to look at our table with curiosity. A few uncomfortable laughs scattered around the table. My face immediately felt like it was on fire, burning with humiliation. But I forced myself to remain calm and composed. Maybe she just had too much wine. Maybe she was attempting some kind of self-deprecating humor that wasn't landing right. I focused intently on my plate, moving food around with my fork, and tried to pretend those words hadn't just cut straight through me like a knife. But Rachel wasn't finished, not even remotely. She continued throughout the entire meal, making little cutting remarks and passive-aggressive comments whenever the opportunity presented itself. When I tried to contribute to the conversation by mentioning how I'd helped an elderly tenant carry her heavy grocery bags up 4 flights of stairs earlier that afternoon because the elevator was broken, she literally rolled her eyes so dramatically I thought they might fall out of her head. "Seriously, Marcus? Groceries? That's what you're contributing to this conversation? These gentlemen here are negotiating million-dollar contracts, managing investment portfolios worth more than most people will see in a lifetime. And you're sitting here bragging about carrying someone's shopping bags up some stairs?" More polite laughter rippled around the table. More pitying glances shot in my direction from people who barely knew me but could sense my humiliation. I tried changing the subject, attempted to steer the conversation towards something neutral, but every time I opened my mouth, Rachel found a way to dismiss me or make me look foolish. Her friends' husbands exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly unsure how to respond to the obvious tension. Some of them actually seemed sympathetic, but nobody spoke up in my defense. Why would they? They didn't know me anything. Then, just as dessert plates were being cleared away by servers who probably sensed the terrible tension at our table, Rachel suddenly stood up. She grabbed her wine glass with deliberate purpose and held it high above her head, that practiced pageant smile spreading across her face. For one brief, foolish moment, I thought maybe she was going to toast to our anniversary, perhaps say something kind to smooth over all the awkward tension she'd created throughout the evening. I couldn't have been more wrong about what was coming. "I'd like to make a toast," she declared, her voice cutting clearly through every conversation happening in that crowded restaurant. Everyone at nearby tables turned to look, expecting something celebratory, to new beginnings and finally being honest with myself about what I deserve. The room's noise level dropped noticeably. "I want a divorce, everyone. I'm officially done with this marriage." Complete silence fell over the entire restaurant like a heavy blanket. Forks froze halfway to open mouths. Wine glasses stopped midair. Even the servers standing near the kitchen door stopped moving entirely. My heart started pounding so violently I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, drowning out everything else around me. But she kept going, her words calculated and deliberately cruel, designed for maximum impact. "I'm finished pretending everything is fine when it's not. I'm exhausted from being married to someone who cleans buildings for a living while my friends' husbands are driving Teslas and closing deals. I deserve a partner who can actually provide the lifestyle I've always wanted, someone with real ambition and drive, someone who actually belongs in my social circle and can hold his own at events like this without embarrassing me. She stared directly at me while saying every single word, making absolutely certain I felt the full impact of each syllable. Her friends shifted uncomfortably in their expensive chairs, suddenly fascinated by their napkins. Their husbands suddenly discovered their phones were incredibly interesting. But Rachel just stood there looking almost triumphant, clearly waiting for some kind of reaction from me. I physically couldn't speak. My throat felt like someone was choking me, strangling me. Every lesson my grandfather had ever taught me about maintaining dignity in the face of adversity, every sacrifice I'd made for this woman over the past decade, every extra shift I'd worked through complete exhaustion so she could afford the things she wanted, designer handbags, expensive dinners, weekend trips. All of it meant absolutely nothing to her. I was just the embarrassing anchor weighing her down, preventing her from accessing the life she believed she deserved based on her friends' standards. I pushed my chair back from the table slowly. The scraping sound of wood against polished floor felt deafening in the oppressive silence. I stood up without uttering a single word, grabbed my borrowed blazer from the back of my chair, and walked steadily toward the exit. Behind me, I could hear Rachel's voice, getting progressively louder, probably attempting to explain her actions to her mortified friends, justifying her public declaration. But I didn't care anymore. The cold October air slapped me hard across the face when I pushed through the restaurant's heavy doors, but it felt infinitely better than suffocating inside that room for another second. I walked aimlessly for at least 20 minutes, no particular destination in mind, just desperately trying to process what had just happened to my life. People rushed past me on the crowded sidewalk. Young couples laughing together, groups of friends heading toward bars and clubs, everyone living their normal lives while mine had just completely imploded in spectacular fashion. I eventually leaned against the rough brick wall outside a bodega, hands shaking, just trying to remember how to breathe properly. 10 years. An entire decade of my life devoted to someone who ultimately saw me as nothing more than an embarrassing inconvenience she needed to discard. That's when the car pulled up to the curb beside me. A pristine black Lincoln Town car with windows tinted so dark you couldn't see inside. Way too expensive and out of place for this particular neighborhood. The rear window rolled down smoothly, and an older gentleman in an immaculate charcoal suit leaned toward the opening. "Marcus Reed?" he asked calmly, his voice deep and steady. My entire body went rigid. My first paranoid thought was that Rachel had somehow already hired an attorney and sent someone to serve me with divorce papers tonight. "Yeah, that's me. Who's asking?" I replied, trying desperately to sound more confident than I actually felt in that moment. "My name is Thomas. I'm employed by your father," he stated matter-of-factly, as if this was completely normal. My stomach immediately dropped like I'd fallen off a building. My father, James Reed, a name I genuinely hadn't spoken aloud in nearly 9 years. We'd had an absolutely massive falling out when I was 22 years old, fresh out of college. He'd spent decades building an incredibly successful real estate development company from nothing, starting with a single property and growing it into an empire. He fully expected me to join him after graduation, eventually take over the entire operation when he retired, but I refused completely. I wanted desperately to make my own way in the world, prove to myself and everyone else that I could survive and even thrive without his money or his powerful connections. He called me foolish, ungrateful, and naive about how the world actually worked. I called him controlling, manipulative, and obsessed with legacy at the expense of letting me live my own life. We both said terrible things we couldn't take back, hurtful words spoken in anger. I walked away from him entirely that night. We hadn't exchanged a single word since that awful confrontation. "What could he possibly want from me after all these years?" I asked, suspicion and confusion dripping from every word. Thomas reached carefully into the car and retrieved a large manila envelope sealed with dark red wax. I recognized that seal instantly. My father's company logo, a lion's head in profile, the same symbol he'd used on everything from business contracts to birthday cards when I was young. "Your father gave me very specific instructions to deliver this to you when the time was right. Tonight, Marcus, is that time," Thomas explained patiently, extending the envelope toward me through the window. I stared at that envelope like it might suddenly burst into flames in my hands. Why now? Why tonight specifically? It's been 9 years of complete silence. Why would he suddenly reach out to me now, of all times? Thomas just gave me this knowing, almost sympathetic look that suggested he understood more than he was saying. Your father has been keeping close track of you, Marcus. He knows everything you've been through. He knows exactly what happened tonight at that restaurant. Please, just read the letter he wrote for you. Everything will make sense. Then he rolled the window up smoothly, and the car pulled away from the curb, disappearing into traffic before I could ask a single additional question. I stood there beneath a flickering streetlight and carefully broke the wax seal with trembling fingers. Inside was a handwritten letter on expensive, heavy stationery, my father's distinctive sharp handwriting filling the entire page in dark blue ink. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper steady as I began reading in the yellow glow of the streetlight. Marcus, if you're reading these words, it means you've finally reached the breaking point I knew would eventually come. For 9 long years, I've watched you from a careful distance. I've known about your daily struggles, your stubborn pride, your absolute refusal to bend or compromise your values for anyone. I've watched that woman treat you like you're worthless, like you're beneath her in her social circle. I've seen you work yourself into complete exhaustion trying to prove you don't need anyone's help or intervention. And tonight, I watched her humiliate you publicly in front of everyone who matters to her. But you walked away with your head held high, your dignity intact, despite everything. That's the moment I knew you were finally ready for what comes next. You thought I abandoned you when you left my house that night 9 years ago. You probably believed I wrote you off completely, removed you from my life forever, disowned you as my son. The truth is far different, and I hope you'll understand. I let you go because I needed to see if you could truly survive without me, without my money smoothing your path and solving your problems. Any man can succeed when he's got a safety net beneath him, when failure isn't really an option because someone will catch him. It takes genuine strength, real character to build yourself up from absolutely nothing with no help. You've proven beyond any doubt that you possess that strength, that character I always believed was in you. Now it's time to claim what has always rightfully been yours. Enclosed with this letter are keys and legal documents. Everything I've built over the past 40 years is now in your hands. Properties across Manhattan and Brooklyn, investment accounts, business partnerships, contracts, all of it now belongs to you. You've earned this not simply because you're my son, but because you've demonstrated the integrity and character it takes to manage real power responsibly. Don't let bitterness over this woman destroy what you're capable of becoming. Rise above it all. Show her and everyone else what real strength looks like. I'm proud of you, Marcus. I always have been, even when I couldn't tell you. Your father, James. I had to read through those words at least 4 times before my brain could fully process what they meant. Tears threatened to rise, but I forced them back, refusing to break down on a public street. At the bottom of the envelope were multiple keys of various sizes, business cards from lawyers and accountants, and legal documents with my name typed clearly across the top. Property deeds listing addresses I recognized from walking past them. Bank account information with balances that made my head spin. Numbers I'd never imagined having access to. Corporate paperwork transferring ownership of companies I'd vaguely heard about. My father had been watching me this entire time, observing from the shadows, and instead of swooping in to rescue me from my struggles, he deliberately let me suffer and persevere. Let me prove to myself and to him that I could handle anything life threw at me. And now, on literally the worst night of my entire life, when I felt smaller than I'd ever felt, he was handing me everything he'd spent 4 decades building. Part of me wanted to be furious with him for watching me struggle. Part of me was angry that he'd observed years of humiliation without reaching out. But mostly I felt this overwhelming, almost crushing sense of vindication. Rachel had just publicly declared to an entire restaurant full of people that I was worthless, that I'd never be good enough for her world, that I lacked ambition and drive. And here I stood on a dark street corner, holding physical proof that I'd been more than enough all along, more than she could have ever imagined. One of the brass keys had a small paper tag attached with an address written in neat handwriting. Upper East Side, one of the most expensive neighborhoods in Manhattan. I practically ran to the corner and flagged down a yellow cab, gave the driver the address, my heart racing violently the entire ride through city streets. We pulled up in front of an absolutely gorgeous brownstone townhouse, the kind of place I'd only ever seen in movies or glossy magazines. Warm light glowed invitingly from the windows. The key fit perfectly into the solid lock. Inside was immaculate gleaming hardwood floors that reflected the light floor-to-ceiling built-in bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes on business strategy and philosophy, comfortable modern furniture that somehow managed to feel warm and inviting rather than cold and sterile like a showroom. This place was mine. My father had left this for me. On the polished dining room table sat another envelope with my name written across the front in that same sharp handwriting. Inside was a shorter note, just a few lines. This is just the beginning of your new life, son. What you choose to do next will define everything about who you become and the legacy you leave. Don't waste precious time on revenge or bitterness toward that woman. Build something better than what came before. Make me even prouder than I already am. The world is watching now. I collapsed into one of the leather chairs and just let everything wash over me in overwhelming waves. The public humiliation from dinner. The years of Rachel's contempt and constant disappointment. My father's silent faith in me all these years when I thought he'd abandoned me entirely. The next morning, my phone started vibrating constantly with incoming calls. Rachel called at least 25 times before noon. I ignored most of them, but eventually curiosity got the better of me, and I answered around lunchtime. Genuinely curious what she could possibly want to say after last night. Her entire voice was completely different, soft, almost panicked, with an edge of desperation I'd never heard before. Marcus, I made the most terrible mistake last night. I'd had way too much wine, and I was angry about things that don't even matter in the long run. I didn't mean any of what I said up there. We can absolutely work through this together. Please, just come home so we can sit down and talk properly like adults who've spent 10 years together. You meant every single word, Rachel, I said flatly, without emotion. You've been feeling exactly that way for years now. Last night, you just finally said it out loud in front of witnesses. She started crying, her voice breaking with what sounded like genuine distress. I heard something this morning. Someone called me, told me about your father, about you inheriting his entire company and all his properties. Marcus, I swear I didn't know. If I'd known you had that kind of potential, that kind of future ahead of you. Stop talking. I cut her off sharply. Just stop. You didn't know because I didn't know any of this was coming. But that's exactly the point, Rachel. You judged me entirely based on my paycheck instead of my character. You wanted someone who could buy you the lifestyle you thought you deserved, and when I couldn't provide that fast enough for your liking, you threw me away like garbage in front of everyone we know. Well, now I have the money you wanted so badly. Now I have the success and the status you were so desperate for. But you know what? You still can't have me. Because what I've gained through all this is worth so much more than wealth. I've gained complete clarity about who actually matters in my life and who doesn't. And you don't make that list anymore. She tried desperately to argue, to convince me we could start fresh, that she'd changed overnight, that she understood now what really mattered in life. But I ended the call. There was absolutely nothing left to say to her. Over the next several weeks, I completely immersed myself in learning every single aspect of my father's business empire. It turned out he owned 37 commercial and residential properties scattered across Manhattan and Brooklyn. He had substantial investments in multiple companies across various industries. He'd built an incredible empire from literally nothing, and now the responsibility of managing it all, of maintaining his legacy, rested entirely on my shoulders. The first board meeting I attended, I could clearly see the skepticism written across everyone's faces. Some of these people had worked directly with my father for over 25 years. They knew I'd been estranged from him for nearly a decade. They knew I'd been working as a building superintendent, that I had no formal business training. But I showed up completely prepared, having spent every night for 2 solid weeks studying financial reports, market analyses, and learning the intricate details of every aspect of the business. When I spoke with authority earned from years of hard work and genuine humility, not arrogance. I asked intelligent questions. I listened carefully to their expertise. Slowly but surely, their skepticism transformed into grudging respect. My father had been sick. It eventually came out during those first few weeks. Cancer, aggressive and untreatable, diagnosed 2 years earlier. He'd kept the diagnosis quiet, only telling his closest advisors and his attorney, Thomas. He'd spent the last 2 years of his life watching me from afar, making absolutely certain I possessed the character and integrity to handle what he'd built. When he passed away quietly 3 months after that awful night at the restaurant, I was as ready as I could be. The funeral was small and private, just business associates and a handful of distant relatives I barely remembered. I gave the eulogy, my voice steady despite my emotions, talking about the unconventional lessons he taught me, not through words or lectures, but through his calculated silence. By letting me struggle without intervention, by forcing me to prove myself, he'd given me something infinitely more valuable than money could buy. He'd given me the unshakable confidence to know I could survive absolutely anything life threw at me. Rachel tried to come to the funeral. I had building security turn her away at the entrance before she could even get inside. She sent dozens of letters and emails over the following months, long, rambling messages about regret and second chances. She showed up unannounced at various properties I now owned, trying to catch me off guard. She even tried to get her friends to reach out on her behalf as intermediaries, pleading her case. I ignored absolutely all of it. She'd made her choice that night at the restaurant in front of everyone. Now she had to live with the consequences of publicly humiliating me. About 8 months after everything changed, I happened to be walking past that same restaurant where my life had imploded. I stopped on the sidewalk across the street and looked through the large windows, watching well-dressed couples celebrate over expensive wine and overpriced appetizers. I remembered sitting at that long table feeling smaller and more worthless than I'd ever felt in my entire life. Remembered Rachel's satisfied smirk as she destroyed me in front of everyone who mattered to her. But standing there now, I didn't feel anger or bitterness anymore. Instead, I felt genuinely grateful. Because that horrible night had stripped away everything fake and superficial in my life and forced me to see the truth clearly. I'd been pouring all my energy and effort into someone who didn't deserve it, trying desperately to be enough for someone who would never be satisfied no matter what I did. Now, I successfully run my father's company, making decisions that affect hundreds of employees and tenants. I still regularly visit the buildings I used to maintain, though now I own them outright. I make it a point to personally talk to the superintendents and maintenance staff, shake their hands firmly, remember their names, and ask about their families, because I was them not that long ago. I understand completely what it's like to be invisible, to have people look right through you like you don't exist, like you're not worth acknowledging. And I never want anyone who works for me to feel the way Rachel made me feel for all those years. I saw her one final time, about 13 months after that anniversary dinner. She was attending a charity gala I was hosting to raise money for a nonprofit organization that helps low-income workers get vocational training and professional certifications. She'd come as someone's date, some guy in an expensive designer suit who was probably another finance type with more money than substance or character. When she spotted me across the crowded ballroom, her face went completely pale, all color draining away. I walked right past her like she was invisible, like she simply didn't exist in my world anymore. Because to me now, she doesn't. She's just an expensive lesson I learned about knowing your worth and refusing to accept less than you deserve from anyone. The fundamental truth I learned from this entire experience is actually quite simple. Your value as a human being has absolutely nothing to do with your job title or the balance in your bank account. It's about how you treat people when you have nothing to gain from them. It's about maintaining your integrity when life repeatedly knocks you down. It's about refusing to let other people's shallow judgments define who you are at your core. Rachel desperately wanted wealth and status and social acceptance from people who didn't really matter. She got none of those things from me, and she'll spend the rest of her life regretting that she threw away something genuine and real for something shiny and ultimately hollow. As for me, I gained absolutely everything I needed, not just my father's empire and financial security, but the unshakable knowledge that I can survive anything, that I don't need anyone's validation or approval to know my worth, that dignity and character will always matter infinitely more than designer labels and luxury vehicles. And honestly, that's worth more than any inheritance could ever be.